Yeah. Okay, so here we are for our last regular class. We still have a final examination coming up, and I'm going to be completing our discussion of the literature in the first half of our class today, and then we're going to have our usual intermission. And after our intermission, we'll be coming back and I will be going through the study questions for the final examination. And we'll have an opportunity to talk about each one of those questions in turn. And of course, you can ask questions about the questions yourselves so that we're all very clear about what you are being asked to do on the examination. Okay? So, we have been talking about modern literature, and of course our course started at the end of the 18th century, and then we spent a great deal of time during the 19th century and on into the 20th century. And one of the themes that we have been pursuing is a gradual kind of crisis of faith that we begin to see emerging in some ways in the 18th century, but particularly in the 19th century. And then, of course, this continues on into the 20th century, and now, no doubt, into the 21st century as well. And what we have seen in the past is that during the 19th century, there were a number of factors that came into play that did not necessarily turn everybody into religious skeptics, but nonetheless brought about a kind of quizzical attitude, even a critical attitude towards traditionally received beliefs. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody abandoned traditionally received beliefs, but it was a question for them. And increasingly, people wanted to have answers of, if they're going to hold on to traditional beliefs, are there good reasons for holding on to those beliefs? And there is a whole range of possible responses to that problem, and we have discussed those in some detail as we have gone along. And tonight we're going to be concluding the course with three poets who are different in important and interesting ways. But one of the things that comes up in each one of them is, once again, a question of what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life, and what is the value of human life? And, of course, that is not always going to be answered in very traditional ways. Sometimes it will be answered in traditional ways, but not always in traditional ways. So let's look at our poets, beginning with Philip Larkin. And for those of you who are using the same edition that I am, which is the 7th edition, the first poem is on page 2565. Philip Larkin was a very interesting poet of the 20th century, lived for much of that century, as a matter of fact, and he was also a novelist as well as a poet, and he began his career with some fairly traditional poetry, and then he began to break out and do things that were more and more original, and he established himself as one of the major poets, particularly of the middle and beginnings of the latter part of the 20th century. So let's look at the first poem in our anthology, entitled Churchgoing. And once again, I realize that for a fair amount of our time here, I seem simply to be reading the poetry to you. I know very well that you can read the poems for yourselves, but it's an opportunity for us to get the poem out there so that we're all paying attention to the same poem and following the poem in the same sequence of lines and passages and so forth. And also to provide us with opportunity to make comments along the way on these passages. And also this is of value, I hope, to those of you who are out there taking the course at a distance or people who are not even enrolled in the course and who don't have a copy of the textbook. So, Philip Larkin's churchgoing. Once I am sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. See, he waits outside the church to make sure that there's no service of any kind going on because, well, who knows why yet? I mean, is it because he doesn't want to interrupt a service, or does he feel uncomfortable with walking in on a service? Well, we'll see. I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church. Matting, seats, and stone. And little books, sprawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now. Some brass and stuff up at the holy end of the church, apparently, where there are candlesticks and, perhaps other objects that are used in the religious ceremony. The small, neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence. Unignorable silence. Unignorable silence. A silence which is so pervasive and so dramatically present in a way that it cannot be ignored. Brood, God knows how long. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. Okay, hatless. It used to be, at any rate, that men would, at least in Christian churches, men would remove their hats or caps when they went into the church. And he takes off his cycle clips. Some of you probably know what cycle clips are. What are cycle clips? Yeah, right, to hold your pants when you're riding your bike. People who wear long trousers, could easily get their pants caught in the gears. And so people wear some kind of clips or some kind of tie to hold the cuffs back. So I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. Notice awkward reverence, because this is an unfamiliar place to him. Move forward, run my hand around the font from where I stand. This would be a baptismal font, apparently, usually in the entranceway of the church. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new, cleaned or restored. If it's an older church, it might very well have been cleaned or restored. Someone would know. I don't. See, because he is a stranger here to this church. Mounting the lectern, and the lectern would be the place where the minister or the priest would be for the reading of scriptures, the giving of sermons, and so forth. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring, large-scale verses. Hectoring, very dramatic and very histrionic. It's a word that's used in Shakespeare, in Hamlet in particular. And pronounce, "Here endeth," much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book. Donate an Irish sixpence. Okay, and as the note points out, that didn't really, at the time, have any particular value in England. Reflect the place was not worth stopping for. It's not a particularly interesting church to him. Yet stop I did, in fact I often do, and always end much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for, wondering too, when churches fall completely out of use, what shall we turn them into? If we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment, plate, and pyx in locked cases, and let the rest rent free to rain and sheep. Shall we avoid them as unlucky places? Or after dark, will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone, pick simples for a cancer, or on some advised night see walking a dead one? Power of some sort or other will go on in games and riddles seemingly at random. But superstition, like belief, must die, which is a very ironic juxtaposition of things. Superstition, like belief, must die. And what remains when disbelief is gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky. A shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was. One of the crew that tap and jot and know what rude lofts were. Some ruin bibber, randy for antique, or Christmas attic counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh? Or will it be my representative? Bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub, because it held unspilt so long and equably, what sense is found only in separation? Marriage and birth and death and thoughts of these, for which was built this special shell. For though I've no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. Notice how he's flip and even sarcastic about the church and what the church represents, and yet he realizes that there's something that draws him there. He can't quite explain it, but something is drawing him there. Okay? It pleases me to stand in silence here. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies, and that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round, presumably not only in crypts in the church, but in the cemetery around the church. So what he's saying here, after his being somewhat sarcastic and somewhat flip and somewhat cheeky, is, after all, there is something in human beings which does yearn for some kind of serious meaning. And perhaps not only he now will visit the church for reasons that are not really articulate even to himself, but also in future times, others will as well. And by the way, you can go around England and you can find lots of churches like this, that are, seldom used now, and their congregations have moved on. And it's not that they are totally out of use, but they are to a large extent out of use in many of the small towns. Okay, so that raises a question that we've seen raised with people like Tennyson and Ruskin and Arnold in the 19th century. We saw it raised in a very different way in Eliot, in things like The Hollow Men, or in the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, or in The Wasteland. What does belief mean in the modern world? Now, from Eliot's point of view, it's something devoutly to be wished. You see, that we need to return to the spiritual roots of our great religious traditions, East and West alike. But that's not always the case. What about Conrad, for example? You know, we looked at Conrad and we saw a man who was supposed to represent the best of Europe, who goes off to Africa, or at least to Conrad's version of Africa, and he comes out simply exclaiming, the horror is apparently what he has met, and notice that there's a complete loss of any kind of optimistic faith. So notice that we're dealing with something that is really very, very complex. And here in Philip Larkin, he, you know, for all of his easy way of trying to dismiss the traditions represented by the church, recognizes in himself some kind of longing for some kind of serious meaning in life, or perhaps even beyond life. Okay, well, let's look next at the next poem in the anthology, which is 1914. And as your footnote points out, that's given to us in Roman numerals because those are the kinds of numerals that were carved into stones for the people who died in World War I. Those long uneven lines standing as patiently as if they were stretched outside the Oval or Villa Park. The crowns of hats, the sun on mustached, archaic faces, grinning as if it were all an August bank holiday lark. And the shut shops, the bleached established names on the sun blinds, the farthings and sovereigns and dark-clothed children at play, called after kings and queens, the tin advertisements for cocoa and twist in the pubs, wide open all day. And the countryside not caring, the place names all hazed over with flowering grasses and fields shadowing doomsday lines. Under wheat's restless silence, the differently dressed servants with tiny rooms in huge houses, the dust behind limousines. Never such innocence, never before or since, has changed itself to past without a word. The men leaving the gardens tidy, the thousands of marriages lasting a little while longer. Never such innocence again. Well, what this poem is about in a way is the ordinariness of everyday British life and how there is something comforting for the English in the ordinariness of life, the way in which it goes on, the way in which you see the same people or the same kinds of people dressed in the same ways, the ways in which you see the same kinds of rituals day in and day out, or marked especially on certain holidays. But as the poem develops, one of the things we realize is that there is a serious loss of innocence here. And this loss of innocence is associated with World War I. Now, I've mentioned here before how catastrophic that was, and not only in destruction of life and of human beings and of people's homes and farmlands and towns and cities, but also destructive of a whole traditional way of life. Many, many, many younger people in particular, though not necessarily all younger people, but many, many, many younger people came out of World War I experience with a profound skepticism toward the kinds of traditional values and ideals with which they had been reared. And that's the kind of thing that I was talking about when I made reference in an earlier class to Gertrude Stein, an American, one time saying to Ernest Hemingway, also an American, when both of them were émigrés in Paris. And she said to Hemingway, "You are all a lost generation. And that was the World War I generation. It didn't affect us in America in the same way that it affected Europeans. Not that Americans couldn't be affected by it, but after all, we didn't have the war in our backyards, or our front yards for that matter. We didn't have the tanks rolling down the streets of our neighborhoods and blowing apart apartment buildings. We didn't have people burning up in hospitals that were exploding. We didn't have the horrors of hundreds of thousands of men dying in the mud in the trenches, horribly, sometimes just suffocating in the mud itself. Sometimes, having their lungs literally chemically burnt out with gas warfare. Horrible, horrible, horrible experiences. And they came out of that experience wondering, wait a minute, what is it all about? We have been taught a whole set of ideals about civilization and enlightenment. And this is what our experience has taught us, to be profoundly skeptical toward such matters. And notice here, never such innocence again. Never such innocence again. Okay? So, then we move on to Talking in Bed, a rather different kind of poem. Talking in bed ought to be easiest. Lying together there goes back so far, an emblem of two people being honest. Okay? Two people lying in bed together should be emblematic of honesty and talking honestly. Yet more and more time passes silently outside. Passes silently for the people who are in bed together. Outside, the wind's incomplete unrest builds and disperses clouds about the sky, and dark towns heap up on the horizon. None of this cares for us. Nothing shows why, at this unique distance from isolation, it becomes still more difficult to find words at once true and kind, or not untrue and not unkind. So notice the imagery of the couple who ought to be able to not only express themselves freely and honestly to one another, at the very least when they're in bed together, but then notice here they are in their house. It is dreary, it is dark, it is storming outside, and what we might expect would be that here they're finding a kind of cozy little center for themselves, a warm center for themselves in which they can share this warmth with each other inside the house. But notice that here it becomes still more difficult to find words at once true and kind, both true words and kind words. Or, and we might insert here, at least, at the very least, words that are not untrue. If they can't be true, at least they could be not untrue. And if they can't be kind, they can at least be not unkind, he hopes. Well, okay, that last line, by the way, is, of course, the ironic punch to the whole situation and the whole relationship depicted here in the poem. Okay, and let's look at one more of Larkin's here. A lot of interesting poems. But let's look at Aubade, which is the last one in our anthology. And Aubade, as the footnote points out, is music or poem announcing dawn, but it's more than just that. It's actually a medieval poetic form in which there is the celebration of the coming of dawn, particularly by lovers, or at least one of the lovers, who have spent the night together and now are either saying, oh, please, dawn, don't come, because that means that our night together is going to be over, or welcoming the dawn as a sign of the beauty of the world. Okay? But in either case, it's a celebration, really, of the love of the lovers. So notice how the form is going to be treated ironically here. And the very use of Aubade as the title is going to signal a certain irony to us once we get into the poem. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark I stare. In time the curtain edges will grow light, and then I see what's really always there. Unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible, but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation, yet the dread of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. Now notice, going back to the point I was making just a moment ago about the title and the form invoked by the title. This is far from being a celebration of the coming of the dawn, right? And it is far from being a celebration of the excitement, the thrill of being in love, of the lovers spending the night together as they did in the medieval poems called Aubade. The mind blanks at the glare, not in remorse, the good not done, the love not given, time torn off unused, as in tearing off pages from a calendar, nor wretchedly because an only life can take so long to climb clear of its wrong beginnings, and may never. But at the total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon nothing more terrible, nothing more true. This is a special way of being afraid. No trick dispels this special way of being afraid. Religion used to try, now notice used to, so for him that no longer works. It may work for others, but it no longer works for him. That vast moth-eaten musical brocade created to pretend we never die, and specious stuff that says no rational being can fear a thing it will not feel, not seeing that this is what we fear. No sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell, nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anesthetic from which none come round. See, what he fears is precisely nothingness. And so it stays just on the edge of vision, a small, unfocused blur, a standing chill that slows each impulse down to indecision. Most things may never happen. This one will. Most things, that you think about or fear or hope for or whatever may never happen. But this will happen. We will all die. And realization of it rages out in furnace fear when we are caught without people or drink. When we're caught without people around us to talk to cheer us up, to take our mind off our fears, or drink, or both. Courage is no good. It means not scaring others. Being brave lets no one off the grave. Death is no different whined or whined at than withstood. Slowly light strengthens and the room takes shape. It stands plain as a wardrobe. What we know, have always known, know that we can't escape, yet can't accept. One side will have to go. Meanwhile, telephones crouch, getting ready to ring in locked up offices. And all the uncaring, intricate, rented world begins to rouse. The sky is white as clay with no sun. Work has to be done. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house. So people go through their daily routines. But notice that for Larkin, at any rate, there is a sense of that not having any meaning because, as Gray put it in his famous poem, Elegy, written in a churchyard, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. Okay, so that whatever one does, that's where one ends up. And notice that there's almost a kind of despair here in this poem. You know, yes, we're going to trudge on because we don't have any choice but to trudge on. But to trudge on for what? So, notice this is not a very happy poem, is it? And it's not a very happy note for us to be bringing in here toward the end of our course. We're going to see some poets who are more uplifting than this in just a moment. But in any event, notice how this connects with certain themes that we have talked about before. That is to say, Arnold, remember in stanzas from the Grand Chartreuse, looks down, apparently from a hillside, looks down into a monastery, and he sees there monks going about their ordinary activities as monks, and he wishes that he could join them. He wishes that he could be part of that world of faith. But because he is a man of the 19th century, he no longer really can immerse himself in that world of faith. And so he realizes that he is caught between two opposites, a world which is half dead and a world which is not yet really born. Or remember in Dover Beach, you know, how the sea of faith has gone out, right? Sometimes the sea comes in, but then the sea has gone out. And so what do he and his bride have to hold on to? Only each other, okay? Because otherwise the world is simply ignorant armies fighting by night. Well, okay, so notice we saw in Tennyson, in Memoriam in particular, his yearning for some kind of faith that he can hold on to, faced with this terrible crisis that his dear and very best friend has died, right? So what does he have on to? What to hold on to? What does anybody have to hold on to? And notice that the whole poem is really a quest for some kind of valid faith that he can hold on to. And he believes that he has achieved it by the end of his poem. But notice how he feels impelled to make that kind of search in the first place. People of an earlier time did not often question their faith in the way even that a Tennyson does, certainly not in the same way that an Arnold does, or now here that a Larkin does. Okay, and we could talk about lots of other examples, by the way, and not simply these. Remember that Mrs. Dalloway is actually quite proud of the fact that she's an atheist. She's a rationalist and an atheist and so forth. So, But then on the other hand, as we've said, the case of T.S. Eliot is a good one here. There are people who go back to very, very traditional forms of faith, as Eliot does and did in his own life. Okay, let's flip over to Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes is a guy who begins in one place, but he ends up in another, as we shall see. He is probably best known in the United States for having been married to his famous wife, Sylvia Plath, who was an American. And she died, unfortunately and unhappily, of suicide at a fairly young age, after they had been married for some years. And there was a tendency for a long time for people to blame him. And then gradually that has faded, and he has come out of that, and his reputation, by the way, has been considerably rising in the last few years. So, and he's an Englishman, by the way. So, let's look at the first poem here, Wind. This house has been far out at sea all night. The house has been far out at sea all night? What on earth is he getting at? The woods crashing through darkness, the booming hills, wind stampeding the fields under the window, floundering black astride and blinding wet. In other words, he's in the middle of a terrible storm, right? Till day rose. Then under an orange sky, the hills had new places, and wind wielded blade light, luminous and emerald, flexing like the lens of a mad eye. At noon, I scaled along the house side as far as the coal house door. I dared once to look up through the brunt wind that dented the balls of my eyes. The tent of the hills drummed and strained its guy rope, the fields quivering, the skyline a grimace, at any second to bang and vanish with a flap. The wind flung a magpie away, and a black-backed gull bent like an iron bar slowly. Reminds me of Hopkins, you know, the kinds of things that Hopkins did with alliteration and the sound patterns in his poetry. The house rang like some fine green goblet in the note that any second would shatter it. Now deep in chairs in front of the great fire, we grip our hearts and cannot entertain book, thought, or each other. See, here again, as in Larkin's poem, Talking in Bed, we've got people who are inside a house in the middle of a storm, right? The storm subsides, but it's going to break out at any moment again. We would expect the two of them to be in some kind of cozy, warm place, sharing warmth with one another. But notice, now deep in chairs in front of the great fire, we grip our hearts and cannot entertain book, thought, or each other. We watch the fire blazing and feel the roots of the house move, but sit on, seeing the window tremble to come in, hearing the stones cry out under the horizons. Well, again, this is a pretty bleak poem, isn't it? And a pretty bleak view of life. And then let's just very quickly look at Relic. If you read the headnote to this section of his poems, you will have known that at one point he was an English literature student, and he switched in his last year at the university over to majoring in anthropology and archaeology. And a lot of his early poetry particularly deals with the kinds of things that archaeologists do, when they find relics of not just things, but also of various creatures that have existed in the past. I found this jawbone at the sea's edge. There, crabs, dogfish, broken by the breakers, are tossed to flap for half an hour and turn to a crust. Continue the beginning. The deeps are cold, and that darkness camaraderie does not hold. Nothing touches but clutching devours, and the jaws, before they are satisfied or their stretched purpose slacken, go down jaws, go gnawn, bare. Jaws eat and are finished, and the jawbone comes to the beach. This is the sea's achievement, with shells, vertebrae, claws, carapaces, skulls. Time in the sea eats its tail, thrives, casts these indigestibles, the spars of purposes that failed far from the surface. None grow rich in the sea. This curved jawbone did not laugh, but gripped, and is now a cenotaph. And also, as our editor points out, what Hughes really dealt with an awful lot was what Tennyson called nature red in tooth and claw. Okay, and that was largely the influence of Darwin. That nature could be presented in the imagery of, one creature simply devouring another creature, who devours another creature, who devours another creature, and so forth. And in the struggle for existence, natural selection simply takes over. Well, that's a very cold way of looking at the universe and a very cold way of looking at life. So, we move on. Theology is just an amusing, witty little poem. No, the serpent did not seduce Eve to the apple. All that's simply corruption of the facts. Adam ate the apple. Eve ate Adam. The serpent ate Eve. This is the dark intestine. The serpent, meanwhile, sleeps his meal off in paradise, smiling to hear God's querulous calling. And notice he calls this theology. Okay. It's theology in much the same way as Browning's Caliban upon Setebos is theology. But then let's look at a very late poem of Hughes, Daffodils. And this was written after his long silence about his wife. He didn't talk about her. He didn't write about her. He didn't publish anything about her. He didn't allow the subject even to come up in interviews. But then finally, toward the end, he wrote a collection of poems which are addressed to her. Okay? One of them here is Daffodils. And you know what daffodils are, flowers, right? Remember how we picked the daffodils? Now, see, he's addressing his wife, who's now been dead for quite a number of years. Nobody else remembers, but I remember. Your daughter came with her armfuls, eager and happy, helping the harvest. She's forgotten. She cannot even remember you. And we sold them. It sounds like sacrilege, but we sold them. Were we so poor? Old Stoneman, the grocer, boss-eyed, his blood pressure purpling to beetroot. It was his last chance. He would die in the same great freeze as you. He persuaded us. Every spring, he always bought them, 7 pence a dozen, a custom of the house. Besides, we still weren't sure we wanted to own anything. Mainly, we were hungry to convert everything to profit. Still nomads, still strangers to our whole possession. The daffodils were incidental gilding of the deeds, treasure trove. They simply came, and they kept on coming, and if not from the sod but falling from heaven, our lives were still arrayed on our own good luck. We knew we'd live forever, which is, of course, a poignant and obviously ironic comment. We knew we'd live forever. We had not learned what a fleeting glance of the everlasting daffodils are. So notice the daffodil now becomes a kind of metaphor, even a symbol. Never identified the nuptial flight of the rarest ephemera, our own days. Okay? We had no idea that our own lives were going to be ended. Our own life together, anyway, was going to be ended. We thought they were a windfall, never guessed they were a last blessing. So we sold them. We worked at selling them, as if employed on somebody else's flower farm. You bent at it in the rain that April, your last April. We bent there together, among the soft shrieks of their jostled stems, the wet shock shaken of their girlish dance frocks. Fresh open dragonflies, wet and flimsy, opened too early. We piled their frailty lights on a carpenter's bench, distributed leaves among the dozens. Buckling blade leaves, limber, groping for air, zinc-silvered, propping their raw butts in bucket water, their oval meaty butts, and sold them 7 pence a bunch. Wind-wound spasms from the dark earth, with their odorless metals, a flamy purification of the deep graves, stony cold, as if ice had a breath. We sold them to wither. The crop thickened faster than we could thin it. Finally, we were overwhelmed, and we lost our wedding present scissors. Every March since, they have lifted again out of the same bulbs, the same baby cries from the thaw, ballerinas too early for music, shiverers in the drafty wings of the year. On that same groundswell of memory, fluttering, they return to forget you stooping there, behind the rainy curtains of a dark April, snipping their stems. Okay, behind that same groundswell of memory, fluttering, they return to forget you stooping there. But somewhere your scissors remember, wherever they are. Here somewhere, blades wide open, April by April, she died in April. April by April, sinking deeper through the sod, an anchor, a cross of rust. A cross of rust. These are the scissors now open, so that they form the image of a cross, which of course obviously has a certain religious significance, but it's also a cross of rust. Well, in any event, it's a very touching poem about his wife, now long dead, and his memory of his wife, and his realizing that others, even her daughter, don't really remember her, but he does, and what he remembers is the tenderness of their time together when they were tending the flowers, cutting the flowers, taking the flowers to market, and just basically being together with the growing and living things. So, very interesting poem, and also an interesting turnaround for him, for Hughes. Okay, finally, let's turn to Seamus Heaney. And yes, that's not Seamus, that's Seamus. In Irish, an S, which is before an E or an I, is pronounced like our SH. like Sean, which in Ireland is spelled S-E-A-N, Sean. Or here, Seamus, S-E-A-M-U-S. Seamus, by the way, is James. It's the Irish version of the word James. An Irish poet. He was born and reared in Derry, in County Derry, in farm country. And Derry, by the way, is in the north of Ireland. And I'm sure that everybody is aware of what the Irish refer to as the Troubles. And there has long been a very troubled relationship between the English and the Irish, going back to the Middle Ages, at the time of the early invasions of Ireland by the Norman invaders from England. And then, of course, there's a very long history of not only English invasion, but also English appropriation of the lands of the Irish, to the point where by the first decade or thereabout of the 18th century, only about 5% of the land of Ireland was still in possession of indigenous or native Irish people. That all of the land had simply been, or almost all of the land, had simply been taken away from the people, and they were simply driven off at musket point from their farms and their cottages and so forth. And so there is a heritage of real bitterness there. But at the same time, the Irish realize that they have a very special relationship with the British, and there's a real ambivalence there. And in the north, one of the problems is that the northern 6 counties of Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom when the rest of Ireland became the Republic, the independent Republic of Ireland back in the 1920s. And much of the north is populated by Protestants of English or Scottish ancestry. And they call themselves loyalists because they remain loyal to England and want to remain part of the United Kingdom. Whereas, of course, the Catholics in Northern Ireland for generations have wanted to be united, or if you wish, reunited with the rest of Ireland to the south, and so that all of Ireland would now become one nation, or as the song goes, a nation once again. Well, okay, this is the world in which Heaney was born, in which he grew up, in which he was educated, and in which he became a poet. And we're going to see some of that coming out in his poetry. But let's first look at digging. Remember, he grew up in the country. And in the country, the way people heat their houses, at least traditionally the way people heat their houses, and cook their food, is over a fire, and the fire is not fueled by wood or by coal, but traditionally the fire was fueled by peat. And peat is a top level of a certain kind of soil, and you dig down and you dig it out in blocks that are sort of like our bricks, shaped like our bricks. And then you stack up these blocks of peat in your shed outside your house or next to your house, and then you burn those as you need to in your fireplace, because this is flammable material, but it burns very slowly. So it's very useful for producing heat and to some extent light in the wintertime, and also, of course, for not only for comfort but also for cooking. Traditionally now, obviously, Ireland has become a modern nation, and so this is no longer as true of all of Ireland as it once was. but it still is true in the rural parts of Ireland. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun, which is also interesting given where he has grown up, where, people settle their problems with guns. Fortunately, that's no longer true, by the way. Right now, we seem to be enjoying success in the peace process. And while there's still a war of words going on, a war of words is an awful lot better than a war of bullets. So, under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills, where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug. This is his boot, nestled on the lug of the spade, to push the spade down. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. One of the things that you see in Heaney is this very, very realistic and particular and detailed description of people in rural settings and of rural life. Notice how you could easily imagine exactly how his father is holding the shovel and how he's operating it. Very skillfully, by the way. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. So here, this is not peat so much as this is digging for potatoes. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. The generations here were good at this and very skillful at it. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man in Toner's bog. Now here, of course, we're digging not only, the grandfather is not digging potatoes, he is digging peat. Once I carried him milk in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, now we're back to the father. The squelch and slap of soggy peat, the grandfather. The curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head, but I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. He doesn't dig with a spade the way his father and grandfather did, but he's going to dig with his pen. He's a writer. He's a poet. And that's the kind of work that he does, which is also hard work and requires great skill. It's simply a different kind of work. But notice how he's very much aware of the difference between himself and his father and grandfather in the forms of work that they do and have done. By the way, why go back to the grandfather? Traditionally, an Irish family is defined as three-generational. So that when you talk about a family, you don't just talk about mom and pop and the kids. You talk about a husband and wife and their parents and their children. So it's the three generations that constitute the family. And of course, traditionally, you very often had the three generations living together in the same house. Not always, but often enough that would be the case. Because we're also talking about a country which until very recently was a very poor country, and many people could not afford to go out and have, houses on their own. And so they would continue to live with their parents even when they became parents. And then, of course, the parents would help out with caring for the kids and so forth. So, the grandparents would. Okay, so the forge. Let's look at that just for a moment here. All I know is a door into the dark. Outside, old axles. This is somebody who's like a blacksmith. Outside, old axles and iron hoops rusting. Inside, the hammered anvil's short-pitched ring, the unpredictable fantail of sparks or hiss when a new shoe toughens in water. The new shoe is a horseshoe, right? The anvil must be somewhere in the center, horned as a unicorn. At one end square, set there immovable, an altar where he expends himself in shape and music, sometimes leather aproned. This, of course, is the blacksmith, leather aproned. Hairs in his nose, he leans out on the jamb, recalls a clatter of hoofs where traffic is flashing in rows, then grunts and goes in with a slam and flick to beat real iron out, to work the bellows. Now again, notice this poem isn't about anything terribly profound, is it? It's really a series of very specific, very detailed images describing this man in the setting of his work. And this, of course, is what defines his life, at least in terms of his work. Okay, let's flip over to a poem which is very serious indeed. Casualty. Casualty. Remember what I said earlier about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. He would drink by himself. Who is this? Well, we're about to find out. He would drink by himself and raise a weathered thumb toward the high shelf, calling another rum and blackcurrant without having to raise his voice, or order a quick stout, like a Guinness, by a lifting of the eyes and a discreet dumb show of pulling off the top. See, he's obviously, this person who's being described is well known in this pub, right? So all he has to do is make a gesture toward the bartender, and the bartender knows exactly what to bring him. He's a regular, as we say. At closing time, by law in the British Isles, including Ireland, there is a closing time, which is a good deal earlier than our closing time, by the way. Remember in Prufrock, hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. The bartender telling the people in the bar that they have to move on now because it's closing time. At closing time would go in waiters. You know, we don't see those much down here in Texas, except for people in certain occupations. But, you know, in boots, you know, rubber boots as waiters. And peaked cap into the showery dark. A dole-kept breadwinner, but a natural for work. I loved his whole manner, sure-footed but too sly, his deadpan sidling tact, his fisherman's quick eye, and turned observant back. It's a wonderful line. And we find out that his occupation is he's a fisherman. And of course, Ireland is an island, and, you know, all around the coast you have people who make their living as fishermen. And turned observant back. incomprehensible to him, my other life is being an academic, is being a poet. The my being Seamus Heaney. Sometimes on his high stool, too busy with his knife at a tobacco plug and not meeting my eye, in the pause after a slug, slugging down, some Jameson or whatever, he mentioned poetry. We would be on our own and always politic and shy of condescension. I would manage by some trick to switch the talk to eels. Okay? People fish for eels, by the way, in Ireland, and eels are regarded as a delicacy over in large parts of Europe. So notice when the older man brings up the subject of poetry, the poet switches the subject to fishing or to local politics. I would manage by some trick to switch the talk to eels or lore of the horse and cart, country matters, or the provisionals. And as the footnote points out, this is the people who are called the provisionals. That's a branch of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, which is it's made up of Catholics who are radicals, by the way, political radicals in Northern Ireland. And until fairly recently, they also took to arms. Now, they were not the only ones who took to arms, because there were Protestant groups who took to arms too, and they would periodically fight one another or bomb one another. And that's part of what this is going to be about. But my tentative art, his turned back watches too. He was blown to bits, out drinking in a curfew, others obeyed. 3 nights after they shot dead the 13 men in Derry. Paris 13, the walls said, Bogside nil. That Wednesday, everybody held his breath and trembled. Okay? That's after Bloody Sunday. Okay? Paras were the British troops. This is a very famous event in recent Irish history, that there were people on a peaceful protest, peaceful march, which is basically an Irish version of a civil rights march. And they were gunned down by British soldiers. And for a long time, there was a big cover-up of who was really involved with this and so forth. But more recently, there actually was a British council that looked into it, headed by a very, very famous British jurist. And they found the soldiers guilty. I mean, the British court found the British soldiers guilty of actually committing these crimes. Section 2. Now notice his friend. He'd become friends with this guy. They come from different worlds in a way, right? One is a poet. One is a man who actually works with his hands, similar to what we had in digging, right? But he loved this man in a way, and we're going to see that develop more as the poem goes on. It was a day of cold, raw silence, wind-blown surplice and soutane. Soutane is that long gown-like outfit that Catholic priests wear in some countries and in some circumstances. And the surplice is a white lace, kind of like a smock, which goes over it for performing certain religious services, Catholic religious services. And it's important now that this is Catholic, because we're in a place in Derry called by the English London Derry, by the way, where this violent conflict has been going on. Rained on, flower-laden, coffin after coffin seemed to float from the door of the packed cathedral like blossoms on slow water. The common funeral unrolled its swaddling band, lapping, tightening, till we were braced and bound like brothers in a ring. But he would not be held at home by his own crowd, whatever threats were phoned into bars and other public places by telephone. Whatever black flags waved as, indications that danger was afoot. I see him as he turned in that bombed, offending place, remorse fused with terror in his still knowable face. His still knowable face before the explosion goes off, before the bomb goes off. And then, of course, his face becomes unrecognizable. His cornered, out-faced stare blinding in the flash. Now, this is the speaker of the poem, the poet, who is imagining what this guy looked like in the middle of the explosion. He had gone miles away, for he drank like a fish. Notice the use of, common kind of slang here. Nightly, naturally, swimming toward the lure of warm lit-up places, bars. The blurred mash and murmur drifting among glasses in the bar, right? In the gregarious smoke. The gregarious smoke. Gregarious, outgoing, friendly. Okay? That's an interesting image, isn't it? The gregarious smoke. God only knows what the Irish are going to do, because now there's a law that was just passed that you can't smoke in a pub. And it's almost inconceivable that there not be smoke and smoking in an Irish pub. But we'll see. In the gregarious smoke. How culpable was he that last night when he broke our tribe's complicity? Now, you're supposed to be an educated man, I hear him say. Puzzle me the right answer to that one. Okay, this is the old man, and he's remembering the old guy, right? I missed his funeral, those quiet walkers and sideways talkers, shoaling out of his lane to the respectable purring of the hearse. And in Ireland, it's traditional that, of course, it used to be a cart, that you'd have the coffin on, and the people would follow the cart. But now, of course, it's usually a hearse. But the hearse just creeps along at the same pace as the walkers who walk along with the hearse. They move in equal pace with the habitual slow consolation of a dawdling engine. The line lifted, hand over fist, cold sunshine on the water, the land banked under fog. That morning, see, the speaker here has missed the funeral, because what is he doing? He's having a funeral of his own, in effect, or a memorial service of his own for his friend. That morning, I was taken in his boat, the screw purling, turning, indolent fathoms white. I tasted freedom with him. To get out early, haul steadily off the bottom, dispraise the catch, and smile as you find a rhythm working you, slow mile by mile, into your proper haunt, somewhere well out beyond. Dawn-sniffing revenant, plodder through midnight rain, question me again. And as the note points out, a revenant is a word that's coming into English from French, and what it means is someone who has returned from the dead in a ghost-like way. Very, very interesting poem, and it's a kind of elegy, isn't it, for his friend. An elegy is a poem written to celebrate the life of someone who has died. And there are some very, very famous elegies in English literature by people like Chaucer and Milton and Shelley and Arnold, and of course here, Seamus Heaney, who, by the way, is not only the best-known Irish poet in the world today, but is also arguably the foremost poet writing in the English language today. And to the consternation of many of the English, he was named to the very prestigious chair as professor of poetry, which of course means English poetry, at Oxford University. So we're going to conclude now, and then we'll come back and we will begin our review for the final exam.